On the 12th of June 1942, a 13-year-old Jewish girl called Annelies Frank wrote the first entry in what was to become the most famous diary in the world. Born in Frankfurt, Germany, Anne and her family fled the Nazis in 1933 and settled in Amsterdam. But their situation became perilous again in 1940 when the Nazis occupied Holland and started rounding up the Jews. The first few entries in Anne's diary document the typical crushes and happy life of an ordinary teenager. But in July 1942, Anne, her parents, and older sister Margot had to flee their home after 16-year-old Margot was called up by the authorities. Together with another Jewish family, they hid in a secret annex attached to Otto Frank's office building. Dutch friends risked their own lives smuggling provisions to them. Lively, sensitive, intelligent Anne poured out her heart into her diary throughout the 2 years of hiding. She documented the terror, boredom, and friction experienced by the group of disparate people thrown together by circumstance. Life was tough in the annex. On weekdays during office hours, the families had to keep quiet to avoid discovery. Anne took refuge in books and writing, but she struggled with the expectations of her parents and had a difficult relationship with her mother. She also clashed with August van Pels, whom she considered vain and silly. The tensions were often unbearable, and Anne sometimes felt her diary was her only friend. Her writing shows a developing maturity and precocious talent. Sadly, this was not to be fulfilled. Despite her fears for the future and the horrors of war the family heard over the radio, Anne retained her optimism and even fell in love for the first time. After hearing a radio broadcast about the importance of publishing first-hand accounts of the war, she began to revise her diary with a view to possible publication. But in August 1944, the group was betrayed and sent to concentration camps. A year later, only Otto was still alive. Anne and Margot died of typhoid at Bergen-Belsen only weeks before the end of the war. Two women who'd been helping the family found Anne's diary after the Gestapo raid and kept it safe until Otto returned in 1945. He was amazed at his youngest daughter's beautiful and profound writing and later said, "I never knew my little Anne could be so deep." In 1947, an edited version of the diary was published to immediate acclaim, and the Diary of Anne Frank went on to sell more than 25 million copies. A Pulitzer Prize-winning play and a film followed, and Anne Frank became one of the most powerful voices of the Holocaust that decimated Europe's Jewish population. Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenberg said of Anne's writings, "One voice speaks for 6 million, the voice not of a sage or a poet, but of an ordinary little girl." The annex where Anne and her family hid became a museum in 1960. Today, Anne Frank House receives close to 1 million visitors a year. Recently, letters were uncovered that documented Otto Frank's efforts to secure refuge in the United States in 1941. Sadly, even his friend, the owner of Macy's department store, was unable to help, as the country was closing its doors in the face of desperate Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution.
Three, two, one.